Hello and welcome to another episode of the My DW podcast, powered by Precision Hydration. I'm your host, Rob Hansford, and joining me this week is one of Precision Hydration's sports scientists, Emily Arrell. Hi, Emily, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. Thank you for joining us for this episode. This is going to be slightly different to the norm in terms of rather than being sort of memories and experiences of DW, this is going to be specifically about how to fuel and hydrate yourself for the race, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely. We can go through kind of the fundamentals and specifics.
Yeah, and I mean, before we get into the the specifics of it all, can you give us a bit of a background about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm one of the sports science team here at Precision. I've actually been with the company maybe 4 to 5 years now. And what that means is I work with all of our kind of top level ambassadors, elite athletes, and help them with their fuel and hydration across a lot of different endurance sports, actually. So a lot of ultra runners and triathletes. And then actually a lot of my job involves data analysis of what they do eat and drink during their races, during training. And in recent years, I've worked quite closely with a lot of our paddlers, helped with their fuel and hydration, which is a lot more on the logistical challenges and how to overcome those. But yeah, a lot of my days are spent just chatting to athletes, learning from them, helping them, and just trying to help their performance really by improving their fuel and hydration.
Yeah, I suppose one of the points you just mentioned there would be quite key that I think a lot of people might miss sometimes is the data side of it. Do you want to give us a bit of insight into how that kind of plays a part?
Yeah, it's huge. It's actually from when I started here, it basically I'll chat to these athletes after their races and I'll fully go through what they eat and drink and give them their carb, sodium and fluid numbers. So I'll take that away, do the actual data analysis, what that means. What was that per hour of carbohydrate actually if you had this amount of gels or finished this many bottles, to be able to give them feedback. Because with this strategy side of things, it's an iterative process of improving, and having that numbers and that data point to work on, go again, improve the strategy, is a huge part of it. And then we learn so much from the athletes by getting that. We have this huge database of case studies of what athletes have actually taken in during races, which there's not many resources where you can go and look at what people have actually done. We have case studies on our site that show that information, but as well as like what numbers athletes are hitting, really importantly shows how they're doing so like how they're carrying everything, the logistical side of things of, okay, I'm running a marathon or doing a triathlon or paddling it, and then how do I carry that to hit these high numbers that athletes are hitting now in terms of carbs, sodium and fluid.
So with that then, with obviously different sports people in different disciplines, does that sort of allow you to sort of really find a perfection, or try and perfect what you kind of do across the board for different people, like in terms of with having that bigger data pool?
Absolutely. We learn so much. It helps with our product development, but it helps with the advice we give across sports. I think that there's lots of kind of cross like recommendations. Like I learn a lot from ultra runners that can be applicable to paddlers, and same for like runners and triathletes and cyclists. There's lots that we learn from each other from this data set of not just how people are fueling, but the levels people are fueling. Obviously it is all very individual of what people actually do, but you can learn and kind of be inspired by how other people are doing it to help, especially on the logistical side of things, of what actually is possible.
So how much crossover is there across different disciplines? Because obviously a lot of people might think canoeing specifically is a bit of a, unique style of sport. Same obviously with like cycling. But I mean, how much crossover is there, do you find from the nutrition and hydration side?
Yeah, it's very unique with the logistics, but when you're talking about kind of the fundamentals of like the numbers and stripping it back to what we term the three levers of, you've got your carbohydrates, your fluid and your sodium as your fuel and hydration strategy, there's so much crossover, and it's all about kind of the duration and intensity of exercise, not so much what that exercise is as to kind of the difference in the recommendations. So there's so much you can learn. Let's say you're going out 16, 17 hours on a bike compared to in a boat and or running. There's so much that's transferable then between the three.
Yeah, and what would you say in terms of the transferable elements? Is that the breakdown in terms of the types of nutrients you're getting, obviously, the people to take on?
I think there's kind of three. So you've got the top level, which is like the overall numbers per hour. You've got what they're fueling with, and then the timing of like all those three factors you can definitely learn from. And obviously it is individual, like I said, but what works really well and kind of are helping people perform, let's say these top level carb numbers, for example, of, okay, we know that athletes at the top level, really high intensity, long durations, are taking on these really high carb numbers. And that's applicable across sports for then other people to go and do when you're working for that high intensity, long durations.
And is there a kind of, for if you take ultra for a second, obviously DW, especially the straight through falls very much into that category.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a kind of split that you look for in terms of in terms of the number of carbs or how much carbs you're looking for people to take on versus protein and sodium and things like that? Is there a sort of specific ratios you kind of try to look at?
Like I said, it's all about duration and intensity that would impact carb numbers, for example, of what people are aiming for, whether that be 60 grams per hour up to 90 grams per hour. It's really interesting because ultra running in the last kind of 2-3 years has really come on. In the past, you probably would have heard a lot of people talk about using more real foods than they do now. We've worked with a lot of runners who do Western States, which is kind of 100 miles hot, long, incredibly challenging race. And we go out and crew, and we've done some data collection on these athletes. In the last few years, we've seen so much of a greater proportion of their fuel coming from just simple sugars, carbohydrates, that gels and drinks compared to real food, which you would have definitely heard and seen more of in the past, let's say even 5 years ago. And I think that's something that's very transferable to something like the DW, and probably something that's going to come and start changing in the next few years, especially for those athletes in the front pack who are really pushing at high intensities of like, they're going to be taking a lot of carbs, and that's probably going to be mostly from gels and drink mixes and things like that, or at least a greater proportion than real food. Whereas in the past, with ultra running and other sports, that's started to make that switch. And I think similarly in the future for something like the DW, that will start to happen for those front athletes.
Obviously, you focus on a lot of work on elite athletes and people at the obviously very top of their game. Knowledge can sometimes be very different. Obviously, the lower down, sort of the pecking order you go on that front to an extent. I mean, are there any sort of common mistakes that you tend to find of people that are trying to broaden their sort of nutrition knowledge and trying to do different things? Are there any common mistakes you see in that ultra marathon kind of remit?
Yeah, I mean, the issue is there's so much like contradicting advice, and there's actually so much advice online. And I think people are just focusing on like the little things or like tiny things, or someone's heard, especially this happens a lot in ultra running. I'm sure it happens across all sports, but they hear something has worked for someone and they just go and do that. And it's just a tiny thing that might improve one person's performance, but instead it's just all about stripping it back to the fundamentals. So those 3 levers that we talk about, okay, your carbohydrates, are you taking them in at good quantities for you based on duration and intensity? Your fluid and your sodium based on your individual sweat losses. Are you replacing a good enough proportion of that you don't build up this deficit? And I think a lot of people try to overcomplicate it and add in all these other supplements and crazy things that are going to help improve performance, whereas they need to focus on those fundamentals first that are actually necessary for performance, and then add in little things later on.
And I know you said that obviously everything's individual, which is, completely appreciate. How do you decide for each individual then about what's right for them?
It's a bit of a conversation. It depends on the fueling is a lot more, let's say simpler, because it is just solely based on duration and intensity. And then you might take into account what people have done before in terms of fueling, what their gut can tolerate, and base it on things like that. Whereas on the hydration side of things, I do lots of like video calls with our customers, and we'll talk through more individually about their sweat losses, like I said, so their sweat rate, their sweat sodium concentration, which we can talk about as well. We'll get kind of a bit more information on that, and then be able to like prescribe, okay, your sweat rate is this, then we can dictate maybe how much you're going to drink during the race, for example, and how much sodium you're going to replace.
So how do you calculate someone's sweat ratio during a race, for example? If obviously you want to have a phone conversation, how do you sort of calculate all of that? Because I suppose there'll be a lot of people questioning or going, well, yeah, it's the logistical side of that it could be sort of a bit perplexing.
Yeah, so with hydration, you've got 2 sides to it. So you've got your sweat rate and your sweat sodium concentration. So your sweat sodium concentration, you can get a sweat test. We have sweat test centers all over. They're just an at-rest test that measures, we take a little bit of your sweat just on your forearm. It measures your sweat sodium concentration. So individual. It can be anywhere from 400 up to 2,000 milligrams per liter. There's this really big range. Andy, who started Precision Fuel and Hydration, has a huge sweat sodium concentration. That's kind of where it came from. He had loads of issues in the heat, but you can test that. There are also signs. If you're a saltier sweater, you might get marks on your kit, kind of stinging in your eyes, all that kind of thing that would indicate you're a saltier sweater than someone else. So there's different ways to do that side of things. And then the sweat rate, you can measure at home quite easily. It's something I prescribe across the board to all of my athletes. But you can weigh yourself around sessions. So when I've been working with paddlers, actually, it's something that we've been doing more and more to get an idea of, okay, at race intensity, what is your sweat rate like? And it will change based on different conditions. So what you do is, let's say you're going to go out on the water for a couple of hours, you weigh yourself immediately before and immediately after, and you just measure the difference. So a kilogram equals a litre. You can drink during those sessions. You would just have to add that into the calculations, and you can therefore work out, okay, in those conditions, at that intensity, I lose a litre per hour, or up 2 litres per hour, or half of that if it's cold. Just kind of build up that data set on yourself. And then when it comes to a race like the DW or anything that you're doing that's kind of long, you can, like when it's close to race day, for example, you'll know what the temperatures are going to be and the intensity that you're going to go. And you can predict, okay, my sweat rate might be around a litre per hour. And then you can really get specific with, okay, how much you're going to drink, not to match that. So if you're going to lose a litre per hour, you're not going to drink a litre per hour, but you need to minimize the deficit that you're building hour on hour for a race this long, for example, that you're not kind of 3-4 hours in, you've already got this big deficit, you've got this percentage drop in body weight that's already too great. Let's say 2 to 4% is where the threshold is believed to be, that then you get performance detriment and issues from not drinking enough. So you can get really specific with the numbers if you want to, and it is something I recommend everyone do, weighing and calculating their sweat rate in different conditions.
Talking specifically about patterns, anything unique you find in terms of the way the sort of behavior in terms of paddlers are, in terms from the nutrition and sweat loss, any kind of element really? Is there anything unique for paddling?
I think so. It's similar with like swimming, as in I don't think a lot of athletes would realize how much they're sweating and how much they would actually be losing. It's the intensity factor is huge, right, at times, and if you go out for an hour or two and you wouldn't realize how much you've actually lost over that time, and that percentage body weight change that you've had, so that high dehydration that you can accumulate just a couple of hours on the water, is greater than people think, and therefore I think it is important to measure and not accumulate this high level of dehydration, and make sure that you are drinking enough. Similar, I'd say, in that regards to swimming.
Right. Okay. And is that just a case of just making sure that the paddlers are just kind of trying to take on board more nutrients and more fuel, and just counteract it that way rather than changing what they're doing?
Yeah, exactly. So making sure that they are drinking enough and taking on enough fuel for the efforts that they're doing. I think it's quite common, especially when we're talking about longer ones. We talk about the DW, like under fueling is similar in running, and that one, that obviously you've got the logistical challenges and so much to think about, that it is common, and you need to make sure that you are eating enough, but also drinking enough then to replace your sweat losses.
And how would you say is the best way to kind of reduce the deficit? Because you said like trying to drink a litre of water or whatever in an hour for a 24-hour race is kind of nigh on impossible to keep at that rate all the time. So how would you recommend the best way to kind of keep minimizing that deficit?
It's something similarly with the fueling that you can practice. You're likely not going to be drinking a litre per hour for the whole time, but you're not going to be sweating that much, especially at times when it is colder. Your sweat rate will come down. It will fluctuate over an event like this, and therefore the volume you drink should change with that. And obviously that's very individual as well. A good kind of case study for this, we had Andy and Johnny have both done the DW together in a boat, and really their sweat rates were hugely different. Johnny was telling me that he was drinking double the amount Andy was per hour, because he has a huge sweat rate and they were working really hard. So he was sweating basically double what Andy was. So therefore he needed to account for that and be drinking more. I think that just shows how individual it is, and why that data can help to know just some idea of the numbers of how much you're losing, to help, okay, if it's cold, I might be absolutely fine with a bottle per hour, a 500 ml bottle per hour. If it does get hot at times during the race itself, you are going to have to bring that up.
Obviously, you said earlier there's a lot of crossover between different things. I know you when we spoke before, I was recording, you sort of mentioned about ultra running being, a particular area where there's quite a lot of crossover. So what have you learned from ultra running that is able to be applied to paddling?
I think it's all about the fueling, kind of what I alluded to. I think there's a lot that paddling can learn from ultra running, with how in the last 3-4 years ultra running has really progressed with their fueling, and that's like the quantities. Getting like gut training, people are fueling with higher levels, towards 90 grams per hour at times, even while running. And then also the types of fuel they're doing that. So to be able to hit those high numbers for someone doing Western States for 17 hours, they're using a lot of gels, some drink mix in there to hit that 90 grams per hour at times. And that doesn't mean 90 grams per hour is for everyone across a whole race, but especially when you're working at really high relative intensities, there are a lot of athletes doing that, and they are using more sports nutrition products. So that's gels, chews, drink mix, because when you're working that hard and at that intensity, it's just so much easier to be absorbed. It's quick fuel to just smash back a gel compared to actually trying to eat something and bite down on something. And that doesn't mean that's for everyone, but I think there will be this transition and people kind of using a greater proportion of sports nutrition products, specifically gels, to hit such high numbers as we've seen in ultra running in paddling.
If you're training for the ThruDark Devizes to Westminster International Canoe Race or any long-distance paddling event, you need to have your nutrition strategy prepared. Precision Fuel and Hydration provide education and products for events like the DW, and my go-to are their PF30, PF30 caffeine and PF90 gels. They taste clean and simple, they're easy to take on the move, and the amount of carb in each is on the front of the packet, so you can keep track of how much you're taking on. The PF90 even has a resealable top, which makes it perfect for long paddles. Their electrolyte tablet comes in different strengths, and for me, there isn't a better option out there for staying hydrated during a DW. Check out the link in our show notes to read Precision's guide on how to fuel and hydrate for the DW. And if you have any questions about your strategy, then you can also book in for a free video call with their team and talk it through with an actual human. So, Emily, with the DW specifically, most paddlers train for several months in advance before the race, given the distance and then the nature of the challenge. What would your recommendations be in terms of fueling through the training period?
Yeah, it's really important that people practice their fuel and hydration throughout their training. Obviously, your training is going to build up, and so should your fuel and hydration strategy. It shouldn't be that tomorrow you go out and you try and hit 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. It's a slow build. So in your key longer sessions, you want to apply your fueling strategy and your hydration strategy, and you want to build that up. And there's this thing called gut training. So you can train your gut to absorb more carbohydrates. You can get used to the types of products and foods that you're using. There's always this bit of trial and error in that, but you want to build up as you get closer and closer to the race. So at the moment, you might be able to tolerate 30 grams per hour comfortably. And then in your key sessions week on week, especially when you're out on the water for long times, it's really important that you practice your fueling and you build up. So you might train your gut. Next week, it might go to 40 grams per hour, 45, 50, so on, until you build towards what you're going to aim for, which ideally is somewhere between 60 and 90 grams per hour based on intensity and duration, how long you think it's going to take you.
There's also a period as well from waterside D, you've then got 2 weeks to the race. And I suppose from that perspective, people's training suddenly changes because they sort of, taper off the mileage, getting ready for Easter. How would you kind of adapt the fueling recommendations for that period? Does it go up, or do you reduce it as well combined with the training?
You can reduce it. I think the key thing with fueling and hydration is you'll have 1 or 2 key sessions per week in the full build up where you're going to apply the strategy like at a high level. You're going to do that gut training, you're going to really practice it. But then there'll be sessions throughout that time, and especially in the last 2 weeks, where the intensity might come down, you'll be training less, and your fueling doesn't need to be as proactive. It's not, each session is not for gut training, just the key ones. It's really important that you fuel to get the most out of those sessions, but it might not be that you're aiming to hit 75 grams per hour, for example, during every single session. It will come down. In your key sessions as well, I think it's important that people are practicing kind of their pre-race, their breakfast, their carb-rich breakfast, and their preloading and things like that as well in the build-up. But again, that's just in like the key sessions, so that's ahead of like really long ones, especially if they're going to be hot as well.
Historically, there's always a lot of people sort of carb loading a night or two before the race, trying to get as much pasta in and so forth before they get going. What would you kind of recommend around that? Is that kind of true to form still, or do you have like sort of different approaches?
Yeah, it is true to form. I think there's different ways. We've seen in the last few years people do it a bit more, kind of being able to manage it and enjoy it a bit more than just shoveling pasta in, for example. So just so everyone's aware of the general recommendations, it's all about carbohydrates, and the recommendation is 8 to 12 grams per kilogram of your body weight, which is a huge amount of carbohydrate when you do the maths, but per day. So we're talking about the last 2 days here before the event. And you want to increase those proportions of carbohydrate to hit that recommendation. But to do that, you also want to reduce like fats and fibers in your meals, in your snacks and things like that. The way that's changed in previous years, I would say, is the kind of foods people are using. Instead of just eating lots and lots, like white rice is great, and bread and pasta and things like that. But some people are using more kind of sports drinks, energy drink mixes, chews and things like that, sweets, to hit those recommendations and make sure they do reach that recommended guideline. The most important day is that day before to really go for it and take in a higher proportion. But really, we're talking about those final 2 days. That's something in the past people would talk about like 3-4 days before. We're just talking about those last 2 days, increasing those proportion of simple sugars and carbs. Like I said, white rice, bread, pastas, things like that, but also sweets, drinks, just to make sure you're topping up your glycogen stores. So what that means is when you like on that start line, you've got these fuel stores in your body of carbohydrates called glycogen. You want that to be as topped up as possible so you're ready to start. And to do that, you want to utilize those last 2 days to take in a greater amount of carbs.
And do you worry much about protein during that period, or do you kind of just let that go by the wayside?
Not really. When you're talking about like the proportions of a meal, like if you picture like the classic plate, you want a greater proportion of carbohydrates. There'll still be a bit of protein, and you're basically removing as much fat and fiber as you can. There's absolutely fine to have some in there. You don't want to remove it completely protein wise, but the biggest focus is on carbohydrates and fueling over that time.
The race itself, obviously, we'll focus primarily, for the moment on the straight through race. You'll have obviously your fastest paddlers would be looking at sort of completing the race between sort of 17, 18 hours and up to 20. And then a lot of people and the bulk of the competitors sort of somewhere between sort of 20 to 25 hours. What's the best way for people to go about fueling themselves specifically for this during the race? How often should they consume stuff, I suppose?
Yeah, the most important thing is like consistently fueling. You're never going too long without something. Obviously, like I said, the recommendations are different based on how long people will be out there. So just a general guideline would be 60 grams per hour up to 90 grams per hour. Those people at the top end might be pushing towards 90 grams per hour. If you're going to be out on the water a bit longer, then it'll be closer to 60 grams per hour, which is still a lot, and it's something to train your gut and get used to, like I said. But the important thing is you fuel consistently, be that every 20 minutes, every 30 minutes. People do it differently. Some people want something every like 15 minutes, but it's important you're not going kind of hour-long stretches without fueling, and you are hitting what you're aiming for. So 60, 75, 90, for example.
So how does that work then in a sense of from a logistical perspective? And it's obviously the challenge, and especially sort of people in that sort of 20 to 24 bracket where most people will only see a support crew obviously every 5 miles maybe, which for some paddlers that's might be every 45 minutes. I know there'll be even some paddlers will be like nearly every hour that they see the support crew. So obviously they can take on some food there, time's limited. And also logistically in terms of being in the boat for that hour on the water, it's kind of, apart from a camelback with fluid, it's kind of hard to get access to obviously food to consume. How would you sort of suggest the best way to kind of manage those logistical issues?
This is actually somewhere where paddling differs from other sports, and something I've learned in the last few years working closely with Mads Pedersen and what he's done and how we've developed his strategy over kind of a 2-3 year period in marathon is like predominantly a lot of fuel comes from drinks and carb drink mixes, and it's just an easy way when you're on the water to continually get carbohydrates in. So it's likely that you'll want in your bladder, in your bottle at the front, a carb drink mix or a carb and electrolyte drink mix, so you get the hydration and the sodium side of things too. As like while you're paddling on the water, that's that steady stream of carbohydrates that you're hitting, and then you might supplement that with gels that you can quickly get down. Obviously logistically people do it differently, like you said, and if you are going to be out on the water longer, you're going to want to use some more real foods in that. You've got to take that opportunities when you get out to quickly get some actual kind of bite down. Get a chew in, for example, is a really good way to do it at that time. And mix up the strategy as well, because that's the thing, like you said, like it's really important. This is such a long race, and you're not going to just go solely off like a carb drink mix, like I just said. You're going to want to mix up your fuel products and types of fuel and where that's coming from. Because flavor fatigue is like a really common thing where you just get sick of using one specific fuel product, for example. So you want to mix it up. You can also use it as a bit of a reward system. Like, okay, I get to see my crew at this point. I get that banana that I've been dreaming of, for example, and you can use that as a way to kind of treat yourself as well. But you really want to mix it up. And I think really importantly, you also want backup options. If that's the case where you're going to, for example, you're going to predominantly rely more on maybe some drink mix and gels, but you want to mix it up, and you want, okay, I've had so many gels, I need to like have another option there in case I don't want another gel at the next bit. But you need to keep the fuel coming. Like I said, it's about consistency. So having options there from your crew, a backup option of, okay, I've got some flapjacks, got some energy bars, some actual real food there in case that is what I'm craving at that time, and you need to kind of make the switch.
Be good to get your opinion on busting sort of a myth, if you like, in terms of, there are two schools of thought sometimes in terms of some people think that you can just do a whole race on energy gels and energy drinks and so forth, and others that would say don't do that at all because that's really bad for your health. And actually it will give you a lot of like sugar spikes and it's not so great for you. I mean, what's the reality?
The reality is it's really individual, and it doesn't make a huge difference. It is down to preference. Like I said, when we're talking about ultra runners, which I think is very applicable here, like you see some athletes who are just using gels and drink mix, and they can do that for 16, 17 hours because they've trained their gut to be able to do that. They wouldn't just be able to go out and, like, I wouldn't be able to go and do that tomorrow, but they've really trained their gut to be able to just get used to that type of fuel and those quantities. But then you get other athletes, same duration, who are mixing up more and having more real food in there. I think there's a balance between the two. Obviously, when you're hitting high carb numbers and consistency, especially logistical challenges, it's so much easier to just smash back a gel quick and get some carbs in than fully take your time and eat something and try and bite down on something. So there's the balance where you need to find the right proportion for you of what's coming from your sports nutrition and then what you're going to get from real food.
And, you know, being Easter, you can go through all four seasons in the space of the weekend sometimes, as Easter traditionally tends to be. And you can go from having really hot days to then freezing cold nights, and vice versa. You can have really cold days and slightly warmer nights. I mean, we'll start with the daytime stuff really, and obviously the temperature side of it. How do you sort of cater that in terms of, if you were sort of managing an athlete in the race, how would you be looking at in terms of the hydration and fueling if it is like a cold year?
Yeah, I would say, like, with kind of, as I alluded to with the fueling, you would want different plans. You might have like a hot race plan versus cold, or for like different parts of the race, for example, as the temperature changes. But okay, if it is warmer, I'm going to be sweating X amount more. Hopefully you've done some sweat rate data collection, and then you can account for, I'm going to have to swap out my bottle more. I'm going to need more fluid on me, a greater capacity to hold fluid, or be able to swap it out to be able to drink more at those hours where it is warmer. Fueling will stay the same. Really, you're going to aim for that consistent grams per hour. You might just mix up how you're getting that fuel. If, for example, it is really cold, you might want to use some hot drinks, hot food and things like that, because that is going to be a nice morale boost as well.
Yeah, and I mean the same thing really for through the night, because obviously the added challenge being on the water, especially if it's a cold night, which historically there have been years where it's dropped below freezing, through the night, trying to keep yourself fueled, obviously, because you're going to be getting cold and colder and colder. So how much would you say sort of you have to increase your level of nutrition to cater for that? Do you have to increase much to try and help keep the body temperature up, or?
It's just important that it doesn't drop down, really. I think one way like that would be an issue, or probably a common issue with that, is, okay, because the temperature's dropped down, the amount you're going to drink is going to go way down as well. You're going to be sweating way less. You're not going to want to drink cold fluids, for example. And if you're relying on energy drink mixes or carb mixes for a large proportion of your fuel at that time, then your fuel intake will go down, and that's obviously not ideal. You don't want to underfuel. You're going to start to bonk or hit a wall. So it's really important that in that case scenario, okay, you might switch or have a backup plan that means I'm going to go more to gels or chews or real food, or, like I said, some warm foods and drinks at that time when it's going to be easier. And like I said, it's definitely a morale boost, and you don't want to be forcing yourself to have something that you're not craving at that time. So being able to switch and just be able just to keep that fuel intake consistent is the most important thing.
If we go from sort of an elite perspective, for example, of this kind of race, how much would you be expecting them in terms of like percentages, if you like, of taking on kind of energy gels and obviously energy sort of foods compared to sort of traditional sort of food and drink?
I was talking to Johnny about this. We had a really good chat about what he did in the past compared to what he thinks he would do now if he were to do the race again, and basically would be predominantly up to like 90, 100% of like sports nutrition, just using a lot of gels and drink mix to get through and hit 90 grams per hour is what I would recommend for him. But then you'd have backup options of the more, okay, I'm going to choose there and then real food in case I do get flavor fatigue, or I want to just mix it up or have this morale boost and have an option for real food as well. But I do think for the front runners at such high intensities, to hit such high numbers of 90 grams per hour is what I would recommend when you're going that hard for that duration. That it'll be predominantly gels and drink mix.
And then obviously, if you then wind that down to sort of your more amateur level, I mean, where would you kind of suggest that to be for people that might sort of not be able to sort of take on that kind of level?
Yeah, again, like I said, it is individual and down to preference. I think an important factor in this is what people have done before and what people have practiced in training. I wouldn't say go, even the front runners, I wouldn't say go 100% for sports nutrition if that's not what they've practiced or are used to. I think whichever way you go, whatever proportions you do of sports nutrition versus real food, you've practiced that and you've got used to that and you've trained your gut to tolerate taking on real food, for example, which again, it is hard to do on the move. So, but like I said, it is individual. You'd have some people who want to rely way more on real food. I think it is important that there is a structure and there is a backbone there of, okay, I'm going to aim for 60 grams per hour. So some of that will likely come from quick and easy sources like gels that are just, you've got them there, that's going to be consistent, or some drink mix that is part of your intake per hour, for example. But then you're going to, part of your hourly intake as well might be some real food or a bar or a chew, for example.
And are there any sort of particular type of sort of foods that you think would work really well on the race?
Yeah, I think it's important when we talk about real foods. Still mean simple carbs and sugars. You're trying to avoid high fatty and fibrous foods and keeping it simple where you can. So people do that differently with, like I said, with energy bars and flapjacks and things like that. And then you've got bananas. You could even have kind of potatoes and things like that, rice balls or energy balls. And potatoes are great because you could do salty potatoes and things like that as a mix. And like I said earlier, some of your food might want to be warm food, warm drinks, hot drinks, just as a nice morale boost when it is nighttime and cold.
How much of a part should caffeine sort of play a role in this?
Yeah, caffeine's a really interesting one because kind of what I've been alluding to the whole time is those three levers. If you've got your carbohydrates, your fluid, and your sodium, they're the fundamentals. Caffeine's like a little extra side button per se that you can utilize because it is performance enhancing. But it's not one of those fundamentals. You can make do without it. But it really depends on people's individual tolerance for caffeine. I talked to quite a few people who are going to get on a customer call with, and they're like, I don't have any caffeine. It disagrees with me. And that's absolutely fine. It doesn't need to be in the race day strategy. But then a lot of people get on really well with caffeine. Big coffee drinkers will have it kind of daily, and they can utilize caffeine during a race like this. You can really plan it in and help boost your performance, or even as a morale boost. And there's lots of evidence behind it. So when we talk about the recommendations for caffeine, they're actually not amazing for a race like this because lots of them are based on exercise that's 3 to 5 hours in duration. And when you're talking about over that, even over 10 hours, there's not a lot of science saying you need this much caffeine, or because you're going to surpass the daily guidelines, for example, but you're going to need it, especially if it's overnight. It's going to give you this boost. And the way we kind of talk about it in ultra running and in this community where you're going for, let's say, 16, 17 hours is, what you might do is keep off caffeine initially, for that first part of the race. And then when you start to feel fatigue, or if it starts to get towards nighttime, that's when you might start utilizing it. And Andy has a really good analogy for this. But what you want to do is, like with alcohol per se, you want to, once you've started having it, you want to keep the doses coming. You don't want to have this spike and then not have it anymore, or have this big dose and then not have it. But you might have a dose, and then every 3-4 hours you have another dose. You keep yourself at this level in the body, let's say tipsy. You don't want to sober up completely and not have any. You don't want to go really hard and get drunk. So that middle line of, okay, you want to keep the doses coming once you started to keep those that caffeine level in the body steady and get those ergogenic benefits of taking it.
I suppose that's sort of a really key thing. So I suppose there's a lot of people who sit there and get to sort of Reading, which is when they're just about to join the Thames. A lot of people is getting on for about 8 o'clock in the evening roughly. And yeah, doing a kit change, want something more, and they'll just hit and glug down a flask of coffee before they set off on their way. So I suppose it's not necessarily the most ideal kind of way to do it. And it's not just about the timing of when you're stopping with support crews, is it? I suppose it's more about how your energy levels are coping throughout the race.
Yeah, exactly. it's a good timing, like especially as it get towards nighttime, you're like fighting your circadian rhythm by having some caffeine there. That's a really good point to have some, but it might not be that you have loads there and then none for the next like 5-6 hours where it's just going to drop in your blood. You want to, okay, you've had some, and then 3-4 hours later you're going to have a bit more, be that another coffee or a caffeine gel or some other form of caffeine to just keep those levels up.
Talking of Reading specifically, right, obviously that's the place where everyone's got to come off the water to get their sort of mandatory check to make sure they can carry on down the river and obviously head to Westminster. It's also a point where a lot of people will stop for about 20 minutes to do a full kit change and get into nice, dry, warm clothing again before tackling the night. And it's also, as a result, a lot of people historically have always taken that moment to have like a good hearty kind of meal. I say hearty, but in DW terms, like a hearty feed before cracking on, rather than just a quick flapjack in the mouth. They've taken like a whole plate of food and stuff. Is that something you would recommend, or does that cause too many spikes or issues that actually you'd recommend just keeping it at a plateau across the board?
I think it's definitely a time where you can utilize that to help with your fuel and hydration. You can catch back up on any deficit, maybe if you've built from your hydration side of things, so the fluid and sodium. You might have a drink waiting for you that's a strong electrolyte tab to help kind of catch back up a little bit. And on the fueling side, again, it's a great opportunity, like you said, to have a bit more real food if you've got the time to actually have some. I would say it's important that you don't have a huge feed of like dense dense food that's going to kind of sit on your stomach, but that is the opportunity to eat some real food at that time, which could be some rice and things like that, but you're not going to want to sit down and have a plate of rice and chicken, for example. You might just have a bowl of rice there ready to go, and eat and absorb some of that because you've got the time to before you get on your way, and then switch back to using more of the sports nutrition, for example.
How would you adapt things if things go wrong? I mean, with DW, there's so many things that can go wrong. It can be paddlers just getting tired, falling below their time, therefore taking longer before they can see support crews and get obviously the food and the hydration. There's also potential issues sometimes that if support crews get stuck in traffic or have issues themselves and they don't make it to a stop when the crew get to where they're expecting some more food and drink, and there's nobody there to service them, and they have to carry on. It's another hour before they'll see their crew again. How would you sort of recommend people kind of overcome those issues throughout the race?
Yeah, backup options definitely, and having extra with you in terms of fuel, especially. You don't want to be under fueling. If you like a section's going to take longer than you predicted, you need to kind of have a backup for that. That means you're not going to go another hour without fuel if you don't see your crew, for example. For example, let's say you're going to aim for 60 grams per hour, you want to carry the capacity to do a little bit more than that as well, because you're not going to finish every gel. There'll be some left over. You're not going to finish every bottle, get every single carb. It's not kind of the specifics. You don't need to hit exactly 60 grams per hour, for example. It might be a bit more, it might be a bit less, but I would carry the capacity to do more than that in case sections do take longer. That's actually it happens so much in ultra running where the weather gets bad. You can't, like, it takes an extra hour for a certain section, but be able to carry some extra gels or some extra kind of simple sugars that you've got with you in a pocket hidden away somewhere that you could grab them if you need them. And then similarly on the hydration side, you might have some extra like electrolyte capsules with you just in case you don't see your crew. You can't get that bottle that has electrolytes in that you had planned, for example.
I mean, we've been talking a lot about the obviously straight through race. How would you adapt all of this for the stages? Because obviously it's a very different kettle of fish. You've got some paddlers being in the water for somewhere but sort of 6 to 8 hours roughly at times. How would you sort of adapt things for the stages race?
Yeah, so it's a really good question because there are a few different things that I would change with the recommendations. Lots of the during of the race itself while you're on the water stays the same with those recommendations of carbohydrates and how you're going to do that, what types of fuel. Same with the hydration side of things, the electrolytes and the fluid. But what is hugely different is what you're doing before, and then obviously there's the whole after period. You've got to recover, rehydrate, refuel, go again day after day. So there's lots of different recommendations that come into play compared to just doing the straight through. So beforehand would be the same every day, but you want to make sure you have a carb rich meal. This would be the same before the whole way through, but in the 2 to 3 hours beforehand, again, simple carbs, bagel, porridge, people have different things, toast, and a strong electrolyte tablet is important to mention as well. We call this preloading, but to make sure that you're starting each day hydrated, I would recommend a pH 1500 tablet, which is our strongest electrolyte tablet, 2 hours before you set off, before you get on the water. And that means that you're starting well hydrated. And where that differs for the multi-day is I would recommend people do that ahead of each day, each stage, 2 hours before, an electrolyte tablet in 500 ml, ideally a 1500 milligram per liter concentration, at the least, and that's just going to make sure that they're starting well hydrated. And what you can do when we're talking about day after day as well, you can repeat that and end each day. So in the evening, once you're off the water, again, have a strong electrolyte drink. So pH 1500 and 500 ml with your dinner, for example. And what that does, if you picture like, okay, you've started the first day with that, you build up this deficit, you will get some level of dehydration from your salts and from your fluid that you've lost in your sweat. But then in the evening, you kind of catch back up on that by having this strong electrolyte drink. And then the next day, you're topping up to make sure you start well hydrated. You build this deficit up and you have it again. You top and tail each day with this strong electrolyte tablet is really important. It's going to help on the hydration side massively. And then similarly on the fuel side, each day is the same. You're going to have this carb-rich meal beforehand in the 2 to 3 hours before. But then obviously what's different is when we're talking about afterwards. The key with rehydration and refueling is actually all about the timing. It's important that when you stop and you're off the water, within 2 to 3 hours, you're having a high carb meal, you're involving some protein in that. That's where protein plays an important role in your muscle recovery. And then you have your electrolytes with that. Instead of waiting 3, 4, 5 hours, you are utilizing that kind of 2 hour period because you're going again the next day. It's really important, the timing of that refueling and rehydration.
And during the actual, the days themselves of racing, is the actual recommendation of the amount of sort of carbs and stuff that you're taking on still the same as it would be for the straight through during the race?
It is, yeah. I think it is important, though, when we talk about stages 1 and 2, that you are being proactive with your fueling, even a little bit more than stage 4, for example, because you are fueling for the next day. You need to think about, you don't, similarly with the hydration, you don't want to build up this huge deficit and go into stage 2 with this level of dehydration and underfueled. And then by the time you get to day 4, you are struggling. You're way behind. You've got really low stores of fuel and you're dehydrated. So I would be a bit more proactive, or at least a bit more aware of what you're doing on days 1 and 2, because at day 1, what you're doing during the race fuel wise is really going to impact day 4.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great insight into the fuel and hydration for the race. Emily, thank you for joining us for this episode. It's been really interesting to get more insight into that side of things, and hopefully for viewers and listeners, it's helped you get a better idea of how to go training for the race and making sure that you're fully fueled and prepared when it comes to Easter this year. But Emily, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.